Hey everybody, it's Meredith Miller with Inner Integration. Today, the message that I have for you is a liberating perspective on parental and familial abuse. I just saw this video from Stefan Molyneux. He's got a channel on YouTube. I'm going to put the link to this video below in the video description. This was by far the best perspective I have ever heard on the topic. So what I want to do is just give a little summary of the main points that he said that were just massively moving for me, and then relate that to our topic of narcissistic abuse. So the first thing he said is you need to recognize and identify that evil was a chosen action by the people in your family. By evil, he means the abuse that they did to you, right? And so often, I hear from people, well, are they really conscious of what they're doing or not? And I really don't think that they know what they're doing. And so he said the same thing that I had heard from some other people, which is when you see this person out in public and they put on this act and they choose not to abuse you and they choose to act in a certain way in public, and then once you're behind doors, that's when they unleash all of that evil. That shows you that they are 100% making a free will choice, what he calls a 100% self-indulgent act of evil. Okay, so let that sink in if that's the first time you're hearing this. So, when you see that they're capable of not abusing you, but then you see that they carefully choose when they abuse you, that's 100% free will. That means they own 100% self-responsibility for what they're doing. We need to give them that self-responsibility. He says, giving them that 100% self-responsibility takes away their excuse, and it liberates you from that cycle of history, from what I call the legacy of abuse. So that's powerful. Identify as evil that it's a chosen action by the people in your family. They chose to do that to you. Number 2, he says, if you give your parents forgiveness, you give yourself permission. Now that's powerful. I haven't heard this one before. This is generally the case of the people who got abused. This video, by the way, he's relating it to Kevin Spacey. So the whole first part of the video is on the topic of Kevin Spacey, who had abusive parents and, et cetera, et cetera. So this is typically what happens with abusers, with the narcissist, with, the sociopath and psychopath is, they will often justify, even borderline sometimes, will justify their behaviors based on what was done to them and say, well, I had a bad childhood. So when we say, our parents had a bad childhood, when we say they did the best they could, we're giving them excuses, we're giving them cop-outs. And he says what happens is that we unconsciously apply the same rules to our parents as we apply to ourselves. So if we say, well, they did the best they could, well, they had a bad childhood, then what happens is that ends up justifying that, well, you had a bad childhood, so it's okay that you're like this. You could flip it on the other side to which is the majority of the audience that I'm speaking to, which is if you say, well, it's because I had a bad childhood. And if we live our whole life feeling like because I had a bad childhood and I was abused, I'm never going to meet a wonderful person. I'm only ever going to meet people who abuse me in personal relationships, in work, in friendships, et cetera, right? So that can be applied both ways. And so what he said, though, is that, and this was just massive, when you give them these excuses and you buy these excuses, what happens then is you end up punishing yourself for being angry at the abuse. You punish yourself for being angry at the abuse, and then that toxicity doesn't allow you to create boundaries, healthy boundaries, with other people who abuse you. So you see how the cycle just goes on. You just keep getting abused, or on the flip side, people become abusers because they justify it on having a bad childhood. So you're just going to keep accepting that, what he calls evil, from others, evil meaning in a moral way. He's not speaking from a spiritual perspective, he's speaking from a moral perspective, a logical, a pragmatic perspective. If you accept that evil behavior, from your parents, and well, because of blah, 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 then what's going to happen? Well, they had a bad childhood. What's going to happen? You're going to meet your next dating partner and they're going to have a bad childhood and they end up abusing you, and you end up giving them that excuse. Well, they had a bad childhood. They're just like my dad. They're just like my mom. That sort of thing. So another thing too about the forgiveness idea, Stefan said, at some point, like decades of abuse, they've gone so far that there's nothing they can do to make it okay. So it's okay if you don't forgive them. There may not be restitution for what happened to you. I think sometimes there's a lot of pressure around the forgiveness, and I think I was putting that same pressure on myself earlier on in the self-healing journey with my mother particularly. It was a lot easier to release the feelings and get to this point of neutrality, which I generally have for all the exes and people, that I met in my adult life. I have a general sense of neutrality. I'm not really happy or sad about what happened. With my mother, that was the big thing. That was the thing. I kept beating myself up for not, being so far along in the healing process and not being able to forgive her. And then I had this big flu virus thing. I don't know, the last 2 weeks, it started the day I got back from the trip. I hadn't been sick like that in 5 years. I take amazing care of my body with food, nutrition, and everything. And anytime I feel anything coming on, I have all these holistic go-tos. And I tried everything in my arsenal, and I couldn't stop this thing from setting into my body. And the symptoms that I were having were so bizarre. It was beyond just the typical flu. It was like some kind of purge. My lymph nodes were swollen. I had had problems with that years before. And so I was having all these flashbacks of being at the doctor's office with my mom and all these scenes. And I was feeling this anger. And then I was can you forgive her? And I was struggling with this. And that was what was keeping me stuck in there, because I was trying to purge that evil from my body. So, if you don't feel like you can forgive, then don't forgive. If forgiving means you give them a pass, you give them an excuse, that is dangerous, because maybe you don't go back to them. Maybe you're clear you're never going to speak to your parent again, but then maybe you accept it from the next person who shows up. So get real with yourself on that, and if you can forgive or not, and don't put too much pressure on yourself either way. The other thing that Stefan said that really moved me was putting high standards on yourself and putting low standards on your parents or anybody else is just another form of abuse. Wow, right? So what he related this to was, if you give them the opportunity, if you address the abuse with them now as an adult, you have this benevolent confrontation with them and you bring it up, and they say, I don't remember, which is exactly the excuse that Kevin Spacey used. I don't remember, and isn't it funny that Spacey remembers that he was drunk at the party, but he doesn't remember that he sexually abused a boy, right? So if the parent says to you, I don't remember the abuse, and maybe that's one of the multiple excuses that they have, he says, okay, was that excuse afforded to you at 8 years old when you did something bad or mischievous and you got in trouble and they asked you and you were like, I don't remember. Did they allow that excuse? So your 8-year-old version was not given that. Your 8-year-old version, he says, was held to a higher standard than you're holding your parent right now if you're allowing them to say, I just don't remember, right? And you know what that is. That's called gaslighting. That's called gaslighting. It's one of the many excuses that my mom used when I confronted her. So he says, when you give them the opportunity to apologize, when they come back with that, you have to understand that they're denying your experience of abuse. And when they are denying your experience of abuse, that means the abuse is still continuing. And that is exactly what happened with my mom. It just got a lot more subtle. It got a lot more sophisticated. And that's something Stefan also said in the video, is that the older they get, the more sophisticated the abuse gets. Maybe when you were younger than 10 or 14, they were hitting you or something. Now, of course, with narcissistic abuse, physical abuse isn't always what happens. It's often a very invisible form of abuse, but very real and very damaging, just as damaging as physical and sexual abuse. So, if you give that excuse to your parents, what's going to happen is you're going to continue to give that excuse to other people. You're going to have no defenses against these people. You're going to have no sense of self-trust. So what do you do with this? What does he recommend? He says, everybody gets free will. That's the quote he keeps saying in the video. Everybody gets free will. What he means is that everybody needs to be held to the responsibility standard. Everybody needs to own 100% self-responsibility for their choices, for choosing the path that they do. I had this business partner in Peru who massively screwed me over. At the end, he offered me a ride to go somewhere. And on the way there, he used the opportunity to tell me, there really is no free will in the universe. So everything just happened exactly as it was supposed to happen. All he did was absolve himself of any responsibility. That is the perfect mantra for a sociopath to have. Well, there's no real free will, So he just goes about and does what he does and then says, well, it's just supposed to happen. So, what Stefan is saying in the video, which I recommend as well, when you take that stance against evil, you are going to recoil from it when you see it. When you see it in your significant other, when you see it in a friend, when you see it in a random on the street, when you see it in your next boss or coworker, you're going to take a stand against that. You're not going to allow that to happen. So this really is an incredible prevention against further abuse, is getting very clear with yourself on what are your standards and getting yourself in integrity with your actions with that. So the mistake that I had made earlier on in the healing journey was I was setting new boundaries with my mom. After I had confronted her, I was continuing to set new boundaries with her, gray rock contact, minimal contact, only allowing a few text messages a month from her towards the end, but I was still allowing that. So my own nervous system was betraying me. When I would meet other people who treated me like that, I would accept it. I would give them a pass unconsciously. This wasn't even a conscious thing that was happening. So like what happened in May was the scorpion bite, the phone call and all that. Like I suddenly realized that I was not in integrity with my perspective. My perspective on the abuse in the family was, I don't want to tolerate this. This is bullshit. There's no excuse for this. But my actions were still tolerating it because I was still tolerating a few texts a month from her. So then it wasn't until August when I took decisive, massive action and went ahead and went full no contact with her. My whole life changed after that. Within a month, I was living an entirely different life. I had moved, I had met new people, I wasn't meeting these people anymore. Anytime they passed by the radar, it was just like a no way, man, because it was just really clear to me, like I wasn't allowing that. There was no more double standard in my life. I wasn't allowing it from her. I wasn't permitting it from anyone else. That is the exact thing that Stefan said. I mean, that's just proof. When you see the results like that, you see the proof of setting that standard, holding people accountable to that standard, holding yourself accountable to the same standard, and then not allowing that from anyone else because you're able to stand in that point of integrity and that point of self-trust. So, I just wanted to put this out there because I know a lot of you are struggling with the parental stuff, and sometimes what happens is that doesn't come until later. Generally people come to this information about narcissistic abuse because of a recent situation with a significant other, a friend, a work situation, some sort of life situation. And then they get out of that and they start to get on their feet again. And then all of a sudden in stage 2 healing, that's when the familial stuff really comes up. That's when we can really start digging into that. So if that's you and that's where you're at, I hope this video helps you to get that perspective really clear about not allowing any excuses, holding people to 100% self-accountability, not permitting any of that so that you can protect yourself moving forward from these predators, because there are predators in this world and that's the reality. So, when you have this stance with yourself, when you're in alignment with that, when you're in integrity with that, you're going to have a lot easier experience in the world. You're not going to feel like you keep getting betrayed by these people and hooked into these people. It's just not happening. I'm sending you all a big hug.